Anyway, I come from an unusual American family. My grandfather was the head of the American Communist Party between 1932 and 1945. And so in my teenage rebellion, I tried to figure out how do you rebel from a family of communists. And you can't tell this when you look at me right now, but I grew my hair long, and it grew into an afro. But that didn't upset my family. I don't know how familiar you are here in Norway, but I followed the Grateful Dead around the country for a couple of months. That also didn't upset my family. But then I figured out the perfect way of upsetting my family, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And that really did upset my family. I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated in 1989, which was the year the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do post-business school, one day I had an epiphany, which is that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what I set out to do. I ended up moving to London, and then eventually I moved to Moscow, and I set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, which actually grew to become the largest investment fund in the country. So I achieved my sort of goal of becoming the largest capitalist, at least Western capitalist, I should say.
And how was Russia during the 90s? I mean, the story goes about the wild 90s, cowboy capitalism, a lot of chaos. How was it to operate in Russia?
Well, it was both exhilarating and heartbreaking. So, it was exhilarating in the sense that from a business standpoint, they were basically giving everything away for free. They came up with this idea, mass privatization. They wanted to Yeltsin wanted to go from communism to capitalism, and he said the best way to do that is to give everything away for free so everybody becomes all state property, so everybody becomes capitalist. Well, that sounded pretty good, and as an investor, it was particularly good because when they gave everything away for free, these shares started trading at some slight premium to free, which was still free, and so it was just things traded at a 99.7% discount, like oil and gas companies to the comparable companies in the West, and so that was the exhilarating part. The heartbreaking part was that it ended up being a situation where nobody ended up getting anything, really. I mean, the average Russian was destitute, and 22 oligarchs ended up with 40% of the country. And the destitution of these Russian citizens, you couldn't feel anything but absolute horror. The life expectancy for a male in Russia when I first got there was 57 years old. Why was it so low? Because everybody was drinking, committing suicide. There's no health care. Just horrible. Everybody had to basically rummage grow potatoes in their dacha plot to survive, and it was just not a very pleasant thing. And in a certain way, that destitution of the whole country led to a backlash, which is they wanted. The Russian people were hungry for order, and this nameless, faceless guy that no one had ever heard of before, named Vladimir Putin, showed up, and as Yeltsin was no longer able physically to be president, and he promised the Russian people that he was going to restore order, and they went for it.
What was your first impression of Putin? In many ways, people say, and people have dealt with him, that it was a totally different Putin in 2000, obviously, and it changed gradually. What was your first impression of Putin when he arrived?
Well, I don't think anyone really changes that much. I think that certain people. So Putin. Putin was a little man. He's like, I don't know, 5'4" or something like that. He has no facial expressions. I don't know whether he mastered this. He's not actually that good at most things other than brutality. But he would be a great poker player if you played poker with him, because he has this face, you just can't tell anything from his face. And Putin was whatever you wanted him to be when he first came into power. So he made a few very grand promises, restoring order, bringing normalcy back to life, getting rid of the oligarchs, It all sounded pretty good. And he was also a little scared of his job. It wasn't like he had been planning on this for his whole life. He was totally an accidental president. Yeltsin was looking for a successor, and Yeltsin picked 3 other people before Putin. Each one of them picked, fired, picked, fired, picked, fired. And they were running out of time, and so they picked this guy who nobody knew much about. And so it wasn't like he had known in advance that he was going to be president, and he showed up, and he was pretty scared of the job, and he was scared of the Russian people. And so for the first couple of years, I would argue that he was sort of a boring technocrat. He wasn't this tyrant like we see right now. And I actually kind of liked him in the first year or two because he was doing economic reforms, and I mean, he would. There was nothing exciting about him, but nobody wanted excitement. People just wanted something normal. And the thing that really excited me at first was when he arrested the first oligarch, the biggest oligarch in Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos. I thought, wow, one down, and
a man of action,
and 21 to go.
But before, let me just go slightly backwards, Bill. And there has been a lot of discussions about the way that Vladimir Putin rise to power, and especially his FSB, former KGB creds. And I'm talking about the bombing of the apartment buildings in Moscow, which at that time there was much freer press in Moscow and Russia, and there are hard evidence that the FSB, not the Chechen terrorists who were framed for the actions, were behind it. Did you have an impression about it, and what does it say, if it's true? And it certainly seems that way to me, that he actually, with his FSB comrades, was behind bombing Moscow to get his political capital, to continue the Chechen war and have political capital.
Really, thank you for asking that question, because it's the original sin that leads us to today. So I was living in Moscow when this was going on, and it was really interesting and horrifying. So you live in Moscow, a big apartment building blows up, 100 people dead. And so you're sitting there thinking, okay, wow, that's terrible. That's a terrible terrorist act. And then another apartment building blows up. And you think, oh my God, this is like a series of terrorist attacks, and I could be next. And there wasn't a person in Moscow in that period, in 1999, that didn't fear going to bed at night, waking up and having their apartment bombed. And so the entire city of Moscow, and it wasn't just Moscow, it was other neighboring places, everybody was just in a state of total tension, and then they blamed it on the Chechens. And then the craziest thing happened, which is that there was a apartment building. I think it was in Ryazan, which is a different city, a provincial city, where they were planning to blow up another building, and whoever was organizing this thing didn't tell the local police to stay away, and some neighbor or some resident saw this, and they surrounded the person. They called the police, and it turned out to be not a Chechen but a member of the FSB. And everyone was and when the Russians mess up these things, they like say the wrong thing and they backpedal and so on and so forth, and basically an FSB agent got caught doing it, and it was so if he was doing that building, obviously they were doing the other buildings. They came up with some idea that this was a training exercise to see how vigilant everybody was and blah, blah, blah. But the FSB was blowing up the apartment buildings. But they glossed over the fact that the FSB got caught. They blamed it on the Chechens. This little nameless, faceless man named Vladimir Putin then announces he's going to go to war with these terrible terrorist apartment bombers. And he made this famous speech. He says that we're going to go after these people and we're going to bomb them, even if we bomb them in the shit house, meaning the outhouse, using the word shit. And everyone said, yes, a strong man is here for us. He's finally. And they go and embark on this ruthless, absolute, destructive, murderous war, killing Chechens left, right, and center. 50,000 dead in Grozny, and the Russians love that, and his approval ratings go from 0, no one ever heard of him, to more than 51%. He wins the election and becomes formally the president. And so, why is this the original sin? Because Putin understands the the value of war in terms of popularity. And that was the first time he did it, to get to power, and it wasn't the last time.
I'll leap forward now, Bill, and the Magnitsky story, which has defined much of your relations with Russia. If you very briefly could tell the Magnitsky story, I know you have done it many times, but what is the short version here?
Well, the short version is that as I was running my investment fund in Russia, it became obvious that every one of the companies I was investing in was being robbed blind by the oligarchs. And so I decided to try to stop the stealing in the only way I knew how, which was to research how it was done and then share the research with the international media. And we exposed Gazprom, Sberbank, Unified Energy Systems, Surgutneftegas, all sorts of big Russian companies. And for a while, these exposés worked. And in fact, they worked because Putin was fighting with the same guys I was fighting with. The oligarchs who were stealing money from me were stealing power from Putin. And he would step into these situations and do something. He would issue presidential decrees. He would vote the state's shares. He would do all sorts of interesting things that would help who would put pressure on the oligarchs and help the share price. Then he arrested Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos, the richest man in Russia, and then after he arrested Khodorkovsky, instead of arresting the second richest man in Russia, all the oligarchs go to him and say, "What do we have to do so we don't get arrested?" And he says 50%. It was the biggest shakedown operation in the history of the world. He becomes the richest man in Russia, the richest man in the world, and the biggest oligarch in Russia. And I was continuing to name and shame these other people, but instead of going after his enemies, I was going after his own interests. I was expelled from Russia in 2005, declared a threat to national security. My offices in Moscow were raided in 2007. They seized all of our documents. I hire a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to investigate. He discovers the documents seized from my office and my law firm's office were used to basically fraudulently re-register our companies. And then after the companies were re-registered, the people who stole the companies then applied for a $230 million illegal tax refund. He discovered this, he testified against the officials involved, and those same officials arrested him in November of 2008, put him in pretrial detention, tortured him for 358 days, and murdered him with rubber batons. Eight riot guards with rubber batons beat him on November 16th, 2009, until he died. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and two children. And since then...
he was also sentenced post-mortem, wasn't he?
But so after his murder, I went on this mission to get justice for him. I put aside, I no longer do business. I'm not a fund manager anymore. I became a full-time activist to go after the people who killed him. And I tried to get justice for him in Russia. And by the way, he documented everything. His way of dealing with the horrible conditions in prison was to document it all. And once a month, he would take a stack of these handwritten criminal complaints, hand them to his lawyers. His lawyer would file them. Nothing would happen. We got copies, and so we had hugely detailed evidence of this torture, and we expected at least some kind of low-level justice, getting the physical executors of his murder. But they circled the wagons. They gave promotions to everybody involved, or all the most important people involved, state honors, promotions. And then, as you said, 3 years after they killed Sergei, they put him on trial in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. They put me on trial as his co-defendant. We were both found guilty. They couldn't do anything more than sentence him to death. They sentenced me to 9 years in prison in absentia. And so it became obvious there was no chance whatsoever of getting justice in Russia. And so,
did Sergei Magnitsky know what he was up against? Did he know the risks when he still wanted to fight for justice?
Sergei Magnitsky was, I would call, a stubborn idealist. I think I think he knew there was a lot of really bad and dangerous forces in Russia, but he also had this, I guess, misconceived belief that there was also some law in Russia. And so when he was put in jail, I mean, even before he was put in jail, after he testified against the officials involved before he was put in jail, I said, "You need to get out." And he said, "I have not done anything wrong." And I begged him to come to London. And he said, "Bill, this is not 1937. This is not Stalin's Russia. I haven't done anything wrong. The law will protect me." And so he stayed, and then he got arrested. And then when he was in jail, they tortured him to try to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no window panes in December in Moscow, and he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor with a sewage bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against these corrupt police officers, and they wanted him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. And Sergei was a man of such integrity and principle that the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was for him, more upsetting than the physical pain they were subjecting him to, and he refused, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And so, I mean, up until the very last moment of his life, he somehow thought that good would prevail, and there was no good in the whole system.
And in your book, Freezing Order, you try to describe how you have tried to locate all the 230 millions and how the Russians and the regime sort of money laundering. And is there a short version also to explain how they actually are able to launder money in Russia?
There's a short version to explain it. I'll do that. But it's if you saw the diagram that we've created to trace the money, which we actually trace. So I've spent 10 years tracing the money, and the diagram is the most complicated thing you've ever seen in your entire life. It's the most complicated thing. But in very simple terms, if you want to send stolen money in Russia abroad, you can't just send it to London and buy a house, because the British banks don't want to get money directly from Russia. So what do the gangsters do? They first, in this particular case, they moved the money to Moldova. I don't know why Moldova is better than Russia, but they did. And I think they controlled a bank in Moldova. And then from Moldova, they sent money to Cyprus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And they love Cyprus and the Baltics because those countries are EU member states, but they still had the same values as Russia, and particularly, particularly all of them, really. And to make matters worse, they would set up UK companies. So they would set up a company at British Companies House, and they would get British directors in some cases, or other EU citizen directors. They would then set up accounts for these UK companies at a Danish bank in Estonia, Danske Bank. And Danske Bank, that sounds pretty legit, right? British company, British directors, Danish bank, Estonia. And so, then they move it from Danske Bank to another maybe Swedbank, and then Nordea Bank, and DNB. Is it DNB that one of your banks here? Yeah. And by the time it's gone through a bunch of these banks, and so it's gone through and all these accounts and all these banks and British companies, it all looks very legit. And so then they send it to Paris and buy paintings or buy jewelry, or in London they buy a house, and it all looks and it's gone through so many different permutations in countries and banks that by the time it gets there, nobody's asking any questions. And so we did this analysis, and every time we would find the money, we would file a criminal complaint in the country where we found the money, and we would then ask the law enforcement agencies to issue a freezing order, that's why it's called freezing. The English title is freezing order, and I guess it's translated here in cold money, which
Cold
is also,
money.
which is not a bad is not a bad
Translation.
and it's interesting. A lot of my foreign publishers couldn't translate freezing order for some reason. Anyways, and so the money would disperse all over the world. But I'll tell you something very interesting. One of the things which we discovered, and this is a huge discovery, and it explains why Putin is calling me out in Helsinki and places like that, is that from the Panama Papers, we discovered that Putin got some of the money. Now, what I mean by that, it didn't go to Vladimir Putin's personal bank account, but one of the heroes, or anti-heroes, I should say, of the Panama Papers. Every country had an anti-hero, and the anti-hero for Russia was a guy named Sergei Roldugin, and Sergei Roldugin was notorious because he was a cellist, and he was worth $2 billion. And the next richest cellist in the world is Yo-Yo Ma. Most of us have heard of him. He's only worth 25 million. So how does this cellist get to be worth 2 billion? And by the way, the money that he gets is like gifts from oligarchs, gifts from state banks. It doesn't make any sense. And so you then look at his background. It turns out this cellist is not any old cellist. He happens to be Putin's best friend from childhood. He was a godfather of Putin's one of Putin's daughters, and he's also the guy who introduced Putin to his wife. And so this cellist is not basically, why do all these oligarchs give this guy the $2 billion? Because they're not giving it to him, they're giving it to Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin trusts this guy. So we discovered this guy received some of the money from the crime that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over. So Vladimir Putin gets some of the money, which is why he's so interested in this whole thing.
You mentioned that you filed complaints wherever you could find the money, and I guess my question is, how well is this money laundering system understood in the West, and how have their reactions been when you file complaints?
Well, what's interesting, so the reaction has been bad for the most part. I mean, good in some places, bad in others. But
why?
Why? In different places, different reasons. So let me summarize the thing. So we found most of the $230 million that was stolen. I think it's gone to 26 countries. 16 of the countries opened criminal investigations. My home country, Britain, which was the recipient of the largest amount of money, didn't. And we filed 6 different criminal complaints to try to get them to do it, and they just wouldn't do it. Why wouldn't they do it? Either there's political direction that they don't want to rock the boat with Russia. And by the way, Britain has not investigated a single Russian money laundering case in 22 years since Putin has come to power. But another country that didn't open a case when we filed the complaint is yours truly, Norway. Norway didn't do anything. Some countries did. The United States did. When we filed a criminal complaint, they went like, you didn't want to be on the other side of the Department of Justice when they came calling. And other countries, which you would never expect. Latvia has turned out to be one of the most robust countries. They've frozen and seized a bunch of different assets that we've identified. France has been really good. They have a criminal case opened. Spain. Switzerland was good. We froze $20 million in Switzerland, and they're now giving back 16 to the culprits. But in any case, so here I am, highly resourced, former hedge fund manager. I've got money for lawyers. I've got a personal vendetta. I've been doing this for 10 years. I've got a team of people working on it. We're finding it all over the world, and these are my resources. If you were just, is any law enforcement agency ever going to do anything about that? No. And so, in my analysis, it wasn't just $230 million that was stolen from the Russian government. It was we've been able to identify just through Danske Bank $230 billion that was stolen from Russia, and that's just Danske Bank. If you were to lift the hood at Raiffeisen Bank and UBS and Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank and a few others, you probably get to $1 trillion. And that I would say that 99.9% of that money is safely offshore. Nobody's investigated. No one's done anything about it.
You mentioned Deutsche Bank, and Germany is a particular interesting case. As I understand it, you haven't found a publishing house in Germany who want to translate your book.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
Well,
And what does it tell you about Russian connections in Germany?
Well, let me just put this in context. So I write my book, Freezing Order. And in the publishing business, you're in the business of trying to identify a book when the author comes to you, usually before it's published, whether it's going to be a bestseller or not. Because if it's a bestseller and you get the book and you're the publisher, you sell a lot of copies and you make a lot of money. It's a pretty good thing. And so we signed up. I signed up my U.S. publisher, U.K. publisher, and French and Norwegian before I published the book. And we had trouble getting a German publisher. So my agent says, okay, well, let's just wait till the book is published, see how it does, because once it does well, they automatically get publishers if it does well. So we publish it, and it is an instant #1 New York Times bestseller in the United States. It sold 5 times as much as my first book, Red Notice, which is also a bestseller. And it becomes a #1 bestseller in Canada, a #1 bestseller in Australia, a #1 bestseller in the Netherlands, another #1 bestseller in South Africa, a #1 bestseller in New Zealand. And even after that, we go to Germany, and they will not touch. I don't have a German publisher. I mean, what in the world? I mean, so this is not about money, because so what is going on in Germany? This is the same country that built Nord Stream 2, that became more dependent on Russian gas when everybody knew that Russia was going to use gas as a. This is a country where it's interesting. After my first book was published, I showed up here in Norway, lots of full house. I show up in the Netherlands, full house. I showed up in Berlin when my book was published, and we had a theater for the 200 people, and like 42 people were there. There's something about the German psychology, which is they don't like people. They don't like people being tough on Russia, I think.
And have bad conscience for Second World War or something?
Yeah, something like that. And
strange.
I don't know what it is, but it's so strange. So here I am, I still don't have a German publisher. So in a certain way, it's kind of a badge of honor at this point.
So if there are any Germans here who have any contacts,
I'm not going to sell it to Germany. No, it's not going to be sold anymore.
Right. I'm very soon going to open up for Q&A from the audience. I have some light against me, but I think I have an overview to notice. I see 2 people at once. But before I go to the audience, Bill, could you just, again, briefly, just tell about the process around the Magnitsky laws, how they have how they come to be, and how the process has been?
So when it was impossible to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky in Russia, I said we need to get justice outside of Russia. And how do you get justice outside of Russia? And the answer is you go after their money in the West. So what I've seen very clearly is they steal money in Russia, and then they buy stuff in the West. And so I went to Washington, and I explained this idea of freezing their assets and banning their visas in the West to 2 senators, a Democratic senator named Benjamin Cardin and a Republican senator, John McCain. And I told them the story of how Sergei was tortured and killed and how he uncovered this crime. And I said, can we freeze their assets and ban their visas? And these 2 senators said yes. And that became the Magnitsky Act. And originally, the Magnitsky Act was just for Russia. And at the time, there was no pro-Russian torture and murder lobby in Washington. And so when it went for a vote, it passed 92-4 in the Senate, 89% of the House of Representatives. And it became a federal law on December 14th, 2012.
But you met some opposition from Obama and Hillary Clinton.
We did indeed. So this was an interesting part of the story. When I was... well, first of all, America is got a constitution which says that the legislative branch, Congress, is a co-equal branch of government to the executive branch, the White House and the administration. And when President Obama became president, he wanted to, quote, reset relations with Russia. He thought that George Bush had ruined things, and he thought that he was a very charismatic guy and he could on the power of his own personal charisma, he could reset relations. And resetting relations meant that he wanted to basically not say anything to Putin that might upset him. And so when I started coming around in 2010 asking for sanctions against Russians, he didn't want to have it at all. And he did everything he could to block the Magnitsky Act. But he can't block. So here the government, the parliament, the majority of parliament is the government. In the United States, you can be a Democrat, but you're not in the government. And so the Senate, I mean, it was just a logical thing. No one would lose a single vote in the Senate or the House of Representatives putting their vote on a law to ban Russian torturers and murderers to come to America. And so it was just an obvious, right thing to do. I mean, there's a lot of ugly things in politics, but this was just black and white. And Obama tried to stop it right up to the very end, but the power of the story and the power of democracy and the power of the Senate overcame that, and we ended up getting the Magnitsky Act passed in 2012. It became global, so it started with Russia, but then it applied to, it became the global Magnitsky Act going after China and Iran and Venezuela in 2016. In 2017, the Canadians passed their version of the Magnitsky Act. 2018, Britain did. 2020, the European Union did. 2021, the Australians did. And I believe that Norway, is it 2021, Gunnar? 2021, Norway has the Magnitsky Act. They don't call it Magnitsky, by the way. The government wanted to sort of tip their hat to Putin and say, we understand this upsets you, we don't want to call it Magnitsky. I discovered last week when I was being interviewed, my book is coming out in Icelandic, and I was interviewed by an Icelandic journalist, and he said, we have an Icelandic Magnitsky Act. I said, no way. There's an Icelandic one, there's one for Kosovo, Montenegro, and so there's 35 Magnitsky Acts in total, and it's really become a huge tool for victims of human rights abuse, and one of the co-sponsors of tonight's event, the Norwegian Helsinki Commission, has been with me the whole time and working on this, and now preparing applications for victims all over the world. And it really is, it's remarkable when I get emails every day from people with the most horrific stories, and they finally have some hope with the Magnitsky Act. And so this really is sort of a...
This is a success story. Had you imagined that it would be this successful when you started?
I don't want to use the word success, in the same conversation as Sergei Magnitsky, but what it is it's a legacy. Sergei has a legacy. His death wasn't meaningless. This is they're not going to be, while Putin's in power, they're not going to build any monuments to Sergei Magnitsky, but this is a legal monument to Sergei Magnitsky, and I feel that makes me sleep a little bit better at night.
That's great. Speaking about the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, I noticed Gunnar as the first speaker. I also noticed the gentleman sitting over there, and also Jan. I don't know everybody's name here, but some of you I do. We will see how many we will have time for before further. Also one there. Please, Gunnar.
Thank you. So in the Helsinki Committee, we have been supporting Bill's campaign for Magnitsky laws for a long time. And you were not always very impressed by Norway. I think it came out in the piece in Dagbladet already. And I remember when I told you we actually have a Magnitsky law in Norway, you were, do you? And yes, we have. And one of the reasons we have is that you all the time had some supporters, even in the parliament, where the Liberal Party were one of the, I would say, most consistent supporters of this idea. And Trine Skei Grande has part of the, I think, credit for this law. And to really have you and, let's say, the Magnitsky campaign understand the Norwegian law and its potential force, we have made a report, and we got some pro bono assistance from Vic Borrain to do it. And this is our gift for you today. I would say to all of you, read Bill's books first, and then this one.
Thank you, Gunnar. That's very good work from the Helsinki Committee. That's a good present, Bill, isn't it? So
So it says the Norwegian Sanctions Act. You need to before you pass this out, you should call this the Norwegian Magnitsky Sanctions Act.
Right. I had the next gentleman on the speakers list sitting there, and also I noticed Jan and one people sitting more behind. Yes, you, please.
Hi, my name is Steven. Thank you very much for very interesting opinions that you brought to us. I wondered if you could weigh in on current events, and based on your knowledge of Russia, of Putin, and the power apparatus that he's got with him, what is the chance that he's going to be brought down, and what's in the future for Russia, the way you see it?
That's a great question.
Yeah, of course. That's the the elephant in the room, if you will. I think you can really draw a straight line from Sergei Magnitsky to the war, and let me do this. What we discovered was $1 trillion of money stolen over a 22-year period. We started pulling on the Magnitsky string that led us to Danske Bank, and then led us to this enormous theft. And that was money that was supposed to be spent on the healthcare and schools and roads and public services. Instead, it was spent on yachts and planes and villas. And you can do that for a year, you can do that for 3 years, you can do that for 5 years, but can you do that for 22 years as a leader, stealing all the money from your people, and not have them eventually, get restless, get angry, get grumpy, get hungry? And particularly after 2 years of COVID, where everything was really stressed anyways. And I think that Putin believed, I'm sure that Putin believed that he had a real probability at some point of something happening, that something unexpected happening, that where the match would light up and everything would go up in flames, and he would be sitting in the Kremlin having to have a helicopter take him out because 1 million people would be on Red Square. And I think that Putin did what every dictator does when they're afraid of their own people rising up, which is to create a foreign enemy and start a war. And remember, in the beginning of this conversation, we talked about the war in Chechnya served him very well in terms of becoming president. The war in Georgia, the 2008, spiked his approval ratings. The takeover of Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014 spiked his approval ratings. And I believe that this war is all about Putin desperate to stay in power. And I should point out that if Putin ever were dethroned, if he ever lost power, it's not like he could just sort of retreat in a dignified way to the Putin presidential library and paint and enjoy his ill-gotten gains. They would come for him so fast, they would string him up from a lamp pole and he would die. And he understands this. And so for him, this is a struggle for life and death. And for him, he needs to stay in power. And for him, going to war is to stay in power. And so what does this mean? It means that you can make any pledge you want about Ukraine being in NATO or not being in NATO, and that's not really what this is all about. You can make some, in theory, you could follow Emmanuel Macron's, wish to give Putin a piece of Ukraine and then have him sign a peace treaty, and that would be the end of it, because that's not the end of it. War, being at war, is the objective. The end game is not any end game, it's just being at war. That's what he wanted. And it worked, by the way. He went up to an 85% approval rating. What didn't work was his military was so incompetent and so corrupt and so hollowed out that they didn't succeed in what they set out to do. And this has turned into a spectacular fiasco, both in terms of 60,000 dead, all equipment being burned, shot, destroyed, and he was forced into a situation where if he didn't replenish his troops, he would absolutely have lost the war in Ukraine. And so he had to do what he absolutely didn't want to do, which is conscript somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million new soldiers. And in doing so, he's kind of done exactly the opposite of his original intention, because people are no longer cheering on a a war, a patriotic nationalist war, they're all running for their lives or being sent to the front and as cannon fodder. And so it's hard to say how this is going to play itself out. I do think that it would be sort of foolish to bet against Putin. We've seen uprisings and all sorts of discontent before. He always quashes them. And this is different, this is worse. This affects people in a much more real way. But we've seen other dictators manage these situations. Kim Jong-un, the Iranians, they've kind of kept everything under wraps. And so, I mean, in an ideal world, Putin loses the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians push the Russian soldiers back, maybe even out of Crimea. If that were to happen, then I think the Russian people would take care of Putin very quickly, get rid of him. And if that were to happen, there's a chance they would take care of the whole, not just Putin, but the regime. And if they took care of the regime, then there's one person waiting in the wings who is an alternative, which is Alexei Navalny. And if Alexei Navalny, who's sitting in jail, and I think you all know who he is, if he were the new president, I think we wouldn't have war, and I think we would have normal relations with Russia and the West. But that's a low probability scenario. The most probable thing is we could be sitting here 5 or 10 years from now and still talking about Vladimir Putin, in the same way as we are about Bashar Assad in Syria.
Who, by the way, was saved by the Russians.
Who was saved by the Russians. We thought he was gone in 6 months, and 10 years later he's still there. I mean, these evil regimes, and the Iranians, the same thing. These evil regimes can really hold on for a long time. And so the most likely scenario is that we're sitting here and scratching our heads, wondering what to do about Putin.
Yeah, we're in for the long haul. Jan, you're next. I also recognize the gentleman sitting or a person sitting behind. I haven't noticed anybody else. Also, you on the first row, and I think that's what we have time for before 8:30. Jan.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the speech. Despite and after Mariupol, after Bucha, after Irpin, still a lot of many Norwegian companies within fishing, within shipping, and within oil is doing business with Russia, are earning money on Russia. What responsibility do you think that Norwegian industry or businesses that still is earning money on Russia have, and what risk do they take? And the second question is, Norway is still having the harbors open for Russian fishing ships or Russian fishing oligarchs. What do you believe that Norway should do with sanctions? Should it's time for closing the harbors? Is it also time for Norway to say, like we did to South Africa, enough is enough, we close all trade and we stop trading with the dictatorship of Russia?
I'm really perplexed when I come here. So Norway, money is the ultimate determiner of almost everything. And Norway has all the money in the world. This is the richest country in the world per capita, maybe with the exception of Qatar. And so Norway really has the financial ability to take the moral high ground, as Norway did with South Africa. And I'm watching other countries, far, far poorer, make huge sacrifices to do the right thing in the situation with Russia, where the maps of Europe are being redrawn, where women are being raped, where children are being killed, and where it's the right thing to do to starve Putin of his financial resources. And I hear, and this is I've been talking about this all day with journalists who've been asking me the same question, that Norway is like continuing to conduct business with Russia and the fishing business and other things. And I'm thinking to myself, of all the countries in the world, if the fishing industry needs financial support, the government can subsidize them. But to not take a moral position here is just shameful and unethical, and really puts the whole country in a bad light for a small number of people. And I hope that policy changes, that what business is being conducted ceases, because it's the responsibility of everybody to starve Putin of his resources, and a lot of other people who have a lot less money are doing it, and doing it very bravely, and Norway should follow suit.
I noticed, yes, you please speak into the mic.
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth. Thank you for a great discussion. I had a question related to the Magnitsky Act. A lot of the criticism of the Magnitsky Act has been that the people who remain or end up on these lists of sanctions do not have the right to a fair trial. And of course, we know also in the case of Magnitsky, it was clearly not a fair trial. How do you defend that? And also maybe to know a little bit of what are the enforcement mechanisms and what are the results that have been achieved through the different Magnitsky Acts? Thank you.
So when we were conceiving of the Magnitsky Act and I was going around different governments and parliaments around the world, that was the obvious question, which is if this is an administrative act where you freeze someone's assets, then what are the rights of the person whose assets have been frozen? And in every country in the world where we have a Magnitsky Act, there is a right of appeal. And so it's not such a terrible thing if you believe somebody, if a government has evidence that somebody is involved in human rights abuse, to freeze their assets. And if that evidence turns out to be wrong, it's not such a terrible thing for the person to go back and say you're wrong. In the same way as if you're arrested for murder and it turns out that you can exonerate yourself. And so the only thing unusual about the Magnitsky Act is they freeze the assets first and then give the person a chance to appeal. But that's no different than a situation where somebody has defrauded somebody and you go into court and you get something called a ex parte freezing order. And so it's all designed to be as fair as it can be in a situation like this. And the Magnitsky Act, what I'll tell you is that in the U.S., which has been the main user of the Magnitsky Act, I think they've sanctioned more than 500 people and entities. The people who are sanctioned are such villains, really it's so hard to get someone on the Magnitsky list that they really pick the low-hanging fruit. That nobody has appealed. A lot of people have appealed being sanctioned for Ukraine. A lot of oligarchs have appealed at the EU and even the US, but nobody has appealed their Magnitsky designations because you can't appeal saying it's wrong to be sanctioned for human rights abuse. You can appeal and say I didn't do the human rights abuse, or you could appeal and say I'm not the person who did those human rights abuses, but nobody has appealed being on the Magnitsky list. And it's very powerful, and we know it's powerful by how much Putin hates it.
Last questions from the audience. You get the mic here. Speak into it.
Hi, hello. So my name is Sophie. I have a podcast called The Political Bark, and I always ask a lot of questions. I have a bit of a personal question. I'm very curious about your first incentive and interest in Russia before you moved there and started doing business there and became the biggest foreign investor. I'm curious to know why you wanted to enter Russia and the first incentives and knowing especially how totalitarian countries are run from the outside. Why the interest and also the huge success you did have in Russia until things got very messy.
That's a fairly big question. So if you have another question, you're going to have two questions, and that's
okay.
Enough.
Well,
When I was, it was, so I had this whole grandfather thing going where I was sort of rebelling from my grandfather, and I had this really weird kind of romanticized view of the Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and it was all after it broke up. So I thought I was going to be the guy involved in bringing capitalism and civilization to this crazy sort of jungle of former Soviet chaos, and for a while it kind of worked that way. I was there from from a financial perspective. I was telling everyone we're on the horrible to bad transition. It doesn't have to get good here; it just has to go from horrible to bad, and it did. It went from horrible to bad, and then went from bad back to horrible, and that was really the heartbreaking part of the whole thing, is that it could have kept on. I mean, if we had just gone on the trajectory that Putin had started in his first 2 or 3 years, and he hadn't gotten all corrupt and dictatorial and there's this expression that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If he hadn't gotten so tyrannical, it could have been a different story. But he didn't want to get rid of the oligarchs. He just wanted to be the biggest oligarch himself.
If you have a second question, you have the chance now, but make it short.
No, I have too many actually.
Yeah, but you have one.
Yeah, I think a question is then a bit about your romantic relationship with Russia and your interest. Would you have stayed in Russia if things were a bit better back in the days? If the thing business was good, so would you have stayed otherwise?
Definitely. This is the thing that this is what happens in all these places. You wonder, like, why didn't Jews leave during the Holocaust? And I was lucky that they kicked me out. When they declared me a threat to national security in 2005, I was really lucky, because if they hadn't kicked me out, I would have stayed there, and far, far worse things would have happened to me. They would have killed me instead of Sergei Magnitsky. That now they're desperately chasing me around the world, trying to get me extradited and arrested and extradited back to Russia. And it was really the biggest gift that Putin could have ever given me by kicking me out. They didn't think ahead. And I would have stayed there, and I would have lost all my money. I would have been in jail, and I'd probably be dead. So there you go.
At the end here, Bill, just a final question about the book, which we are soon going to open up so you can sign just around the corner, and I highly recommend it. It's both written as the enlightened thing about how Russia works, but it also a kind of crime story and a political thriller all at once. When did you know that you were such a good writer?
Well, I mean, it's nice of you to say. I can't say that I know that I'm such a good writer. It was the pain and suffering that I had to go through to write this book so that it was actually readable. It took me 3 times as long as any other writer would take. So I don't think I'm a good writer. But what was really important to me was to I was kind of tricking everybody, because I've positioned this book as a thriller. So you could read this book, you could care nothing about Putin, nothing about money, nothing about Russia, and you could pick up this book and you'd be highly entertained. And so my publisher in the U.S. At Simon & Schuster, he said to me, "You want to hide the vegetables in the dessert," and so I've made this book something pleasurable to actually do. You can read it on holiday, read it on an airplane, read it on the train, and you'll miss your stop or whatever, because it really sucks you right in. And the point is that I want a lot of people to know this story, because if a lot of people know this story, then I can make some change in the world. And my first book, Red Notice, I think it was responsible of the 35 Magnitsky Acts. There's probably 5 or 6 that are directly came from politicians and government officials who read Red Notice. And so it's all part of my campaign, but I've done it in a way that I think I'm not pedantic in my explanation of what happened. I make it enjoyable and interesting and entertaining and gripping.
Do you have a next project? You can reveal something?
My next project is not to write any more books.
Before we give a warm applause to Bill, just let me repeat that we have the book around the corner, and I want to thank everybody for coming here tonight. Thank you so much, Bill Brother, for your work and for coming to Oslo once again. Thank you.